Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.
Hello, I'm Lorene Mills, and welcome to Report from Santa Fe. Our guest today is Paul Barnes, a film editor and producer extraordinaire. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Well, we're here to get some background on and to celebrate PBS-TV's astounding miniseries called The Roosevelts, An Intimate History, and you are the producer and the editor. Tell me about this project.
The project was conceived about around 2008. We got serious about making it. I met with Ken and with Jeffrey C. Ward, our writer.
This is another Ken Burns project.
Yes.
You've worked with him for 30 years.
Yes, I've been with Ken for 30 years. But we got together, and Jeff had written two beautiful biographies of Franklin, but those biographies only took him up to having become president. And I think he always had this dream of finishing the whole life. And then the more we talked about it and thought about it, obviously you can't do Franklin without Eleanor. And then the more Jeff thought about it, he said, nobody has ever really brought Theodore into the picture and done a triple biography. And he said, let's do that in the series. Let's do it with Theodore, Franklin, and Eleanor, and interweave their lives together and interweave the two families and the two family branches from Hyde Park and Oyster Bay. It was a terrific, terrific idea. And I think in the course of the series, you're going to really see the family grow, and you'll understand the interrelationships and what they got from each other. I mean, most people don't realize that Franklin was highly influenced by Theodore. He admired him so much, he wanted to be Theodore.
And the relationship between Franklin and Theodore?
They were cousins.
They were cousins.
They were cousins,
okay.
Yes. And Eleanor was Theodore's niece. In fact, it was his favorite niece.
Of course.
Right. She was the daughter of Theodore's brother, Elliot.
Why is this so timely now? Why did you choose this project now? Because with Ken Burns, you've done the Civil War, baseball, Lewis and Clark, the national parks. I mean, you've done these epics. You've changed documentary history in the world.
Right.
But it takes how many years to do a project like this?
5 to 6 years on each one of these series. They're quite time-consuming. And we try to, we research them heavily. We want to get everything right. We want the visuals to be as beautiful as possible. And we spend a lot of time in the editing room. We have luxurious editing schedules to make sure that the story is told properly, that the history is all correct.
So what was it about the Roosevelt history that was timely, that made you think, we're going to do this one now?
Well, now that you see the gridlock in Washington and so many people have lost faith in their federal government, we all thought it was time to tell the story of two presidencies where our federal government was working on all cylinders, where the people did have faith in the president who was in the White House, where they did have faith in Congress, that the president working with Congress would be able to solve these major problems. And certainly it's true during the Depression, certainly was true during World War II, was certainly true in Theodore's time. One of the surprises to me was how much of a progressive politician Theodore really was, a really forward thinker, and that he realized at the turn of the century America that the Gilded Age and the kind of oligarchy that we were turning into, it wasn't going to work for the American democracy that we were creating here. And so he really wanted to make things much more equitable all across the board. He didn't want to take wealth away from the wealthy, but he wanted to share it more and rise up the middle class and end child labor, begin to end poverty, begin to end the exploitation of women in the workplace. Theodore was at the forefront of that at the very, very beginning. And even though he didn't live to see a lot of what he would have liked come to pass, that baton was passed on to Franklin. And all of the programs he created during the Depression and the New Deal, they're an outgrowth, very much so, of Theodore's political thinking.
And, you mentioned Theodore's interest in what we now call income inequality.
Yeah.
Well, in FDR's second inaugural address, he says, the test of our progress is not whether we add more to the abundance of those who have much. It is whether we provide enough for those who have too little. That is exactly, what's happening right now, what we need to be aware of.
Exactly, yeah. No, I mean, the thing is, Franklin is amazing. You know, both Theodore and Franklin come from aristocratic families, basically, very wealthy families. In some ways, it's almost, you know, how did they come to be so empathetic to the country as a whole, you know, to all the classes? And in Franklin's case, the most wonderful thing about, interesting thing about him is that I think the tragedy of having contracted polio for him is horrendous. But there's an upside to that, because it really changed him, and it changed him for the better. It made him much more of an empathetic human being. Prior to the polio, he was a little bit selfish, very self-centered, a little bit lightweight. And then after contracting polio and having to go through that suffering, and then seeing all of these children and other people from all these different classes suffering from polio, when he started the Institute at Warm Springs and interacting with them, they used to call him Doc Roosevelt, you know, because he was trying to invent new therapies and new exercises, new things that would help all of these other people who suffered the way that he did. And I think that his understanding of all classes of Americans really grew enormously because of that experience. And I think also the whole thing of creating the Institute was sort of like, you know, I'm in charge and I'm going to help solve these problems. I'm going to make life better for these people. And he just carried that over into his presidency, you know. And if he hadn't contracted polio, I'm not sure he might have been the president that he became. Well, you know, so for all the tragedy, there was a positive upside to that horror.
Tell our audience, refresh our audience, just what he did in even the first 100 days, because so many of the things we take for granted, like Social Security and banking regulation, were started by him. He pulled us out of the Depression and World War II.
Yeah. I mean, the country's economy was in total disaster when he became president. And his whole thought was, let's take action immediately. Let's try all kinds of things. And the first thing he really tackled was the financial business here in this country. And within 100 days, 17 pieces of legislation was proposed to Congress. All 17 passed, and every one of them helped to improve the economy of the United States and improve regulation of banking and of business in terms of not allowing things to fall apart the way they did during the Great Depression. And it was actually an amazing run of congressional legislation that was passed in that period. Nobody has ever surpassed him on that. And the other thing about it is that the country was in such major crisis that it was done by Republicans and Democrats.
Yeah.
I mean, everybody realized what a major crisis we were in. All those bills were passed with bipartisan support. If there was any, and compromise. You know, I mean, there was a lot of back and forth. Things were done very quickly, but there was a lot of discussion about what these bills would do and what they would do to help aid the economy. And it's remarkable the bipartisanship that went on during that period of time. And it continued really through his presidency. And it's kind of a lesson for now. It's like, why can't we compromise? Why can't we give and take a little bit? Why can't we moderate here and there and not have to go to the extremes? And that's what really helped to solve these problems at a major crisis point in our country's history. I think we have a lot of problems now, and I think the series really, we're hoping that people will take some lessons from this series and from those two great presidents.
Well, we're speaking today with Paul Barnes, who's the producer and editor of the beautiful PBS-TV series, The Roosevelts, An Intimate History. So one of the things we can learn from this is the importance of compromise. Another thing is just about leadership. What is it? We need, for lack of a vision, the people perish, and we need leadership.
Yes.
And then we've kept so many people out, good people out of running for office because of what we do to our candidates, the kind of character assassination. And the other thing that we learned from watching the Roosevelts is that these are people who were dedicated to the public good. There was no doubt whose interests they were serving. They were serving the country's interest.
Absolutely.
What else can we learn from the...
Well, I think in terms of leadership, it's letting go of partisanship is so important. I mean, I think when Theodore and Franklin both became president, even though Theodore was from the Republican Party, Franklin was from the Democratic Party, but when they became president, they were now working for the entire country. It wasn't for what the Democratic agenda was. It wasn't strictly for what the Republican agenda was. They recognized the problems the nation faced, and they wanted to solve those problems without any kind of ideology from either side to get in their way. And again, I think that's the kind of leadership we should be looking for. The party shouldn't be controlling the way in which these laws get enacted or are not enacted. I think that in terms of public service for congressmen and senators, they should rise above what their party ideology is in many cases and really think about what is the good for the entire nation as a whole. And I think that's holding us back quite a bit right now.
We must take a minute and talk about Eleanor because
Yes.
I am an unabashed Eleanor fan. And I
too.
realize I raised my daughter with all these quotes. A woman is like a tea bag. You can't tell how strong she is until you put her in hot water. And she also urged us to do one thing that scares you every day. Another one that I love is it's better to light a candle than to curse the darkness.
Yes.
This woman was such a visionary,
Yes.
the first lady to hold press conferences, and talk to me a little about her and what we will see about her
Yes.
in this program.
I mean, I think most people who don't know much about Eleanor will be astonished because she was a woman who was well ahead of her time. And again, the interesting thing about Eleanor is that she overcame so many negative deficiencies in her life, and that was a part of what made her so courageous, I think. There were so many things for her to fear, and she kind of overcame that fear time and time again. You know, whether it was the death of her parents when she was very young, whether it was the tragedy of Franklin's betrayal of her during having the affair, having to have to face the crisis of him contracting polio and helping him get through that. Her own fear of public speaking, which, you know, Franklin's Louis Howe, his aide, helped her get over. In the 1920s, when Franklin was really locked behind closed doors trying to deal with the polio, they sent Eleanor out to committee meetings and to Democratic conventions, and Eleanor was a substitute for Franklin. And that gave her a lot of self-confidence and a lot of courage to be able to become a politician on her own. You know, and initially she was like, I'm not going to do that. I can't speak in public. And they pushed her. They said, Eleanor, you've got to do it. You've got to do it. And Louis Howe became a great, great friend of hers, and he was such a wonderful political advisor. He continued to advise Eleanor the way he advised Franklin. And he helped her to overcome those fears. And her confidence continued to grow and grow and grow, I mean, through her entire life. I mean, she was a really remarkable woman and unafraid. Talk about leadership, being brave enough and outspoken enough to bring up subjects that people didn't want to talk about at the time, you know, and she would put them in the forefront and just to get people to talk about them. When anti-lynching bills were going through Congress and they were getting stymied left and right mostly by Southern politicians, Eleanor continued to talk about it. And Franklin encouraged her. He said, I'm roadblocked here. I can't do anything about this. I would love to pass an anti-lynching bill. He said, it's not going to happen because of what Congress is doing to me, but you keep it in the public's attention, and you make them think about it and talk about it, and eventually, this is a baby step, eventually it's going to happen.
Well, we just have 30 seconds left. So what should people look for? How it's on for 5 nights in a row, 2
it's
hours
on
a night?
7 nights in a row.
7 nights in a row, 2 hours
It starts
each.
on Sunday. Each
Okay.
episode is 2 hours each, so it runs from Sunday night until next Saturday, or the following Saturday. So it's an epic.
It is an epic.
But I think you're going to be hooked. I think you'll be drawn in and you'll want to stay through the whole thing.
And voices, you have Meryl Streep, you have
Yes.
John Lithgow, you have...
Paul Giamatti,
Yeah,
who read
yeah.
Theodore for us, he was brilliant, absolutely brilliant.
Yeah,
You know?
well, I can hardly wait. I want to thank you. Our guest today is Paul Barnes,
Well,
who is
thank you
the
for having me.
producer and the editor of this epic, the Roosevelts.
Well, 2.5 shows. I had some other editors working with me.
I'm sure you did. Because one man cannot an epic make.
Right.
But thank you, Paul Barnes, for joining us.
Oh, thank you for having me.
We are joined now by Kathy Flynn. In Santa Fe, we call her the Queen of the New Deal. She's an author of many books, one of which is actually called The New Deal. She is an expert on all things New Deal and WPA. In her library, she has 500 books about the New Deal, 8 file cabinets full of material, and she's worked very hard to preserve the art history, New Deal history, and WPA history in New Mexico. So, welcome, Kathy Flynn.
Thank you, Lorraine. Glad to be here.
How did this become? It is your life's work. How did you?
I didn't plan it, but
You were Deputy Secretary of State for 8 years. You wrote columns. You had radio shows. What happened with you and the New Deal and WPA.
Well, the first week on the job was Stephanie Gonzalez, Secretary of State. She said, "You will be responsible for compiling and editing the New Mexico Blue Book." I had not a clue what that was until then I remembered that my husband, Jack, had a ton of blue books up on a top shelf. So I started looking into it and indeed found that it was quite a reference and resource book on New Mexico. And it had various chapters. And I wanted to divide the book up with photographs between each chapter. And someone suggested I divide it with pictures of murals. Immediately, this mural flashed into my head. I didn't know why or where or what. And it came back down into my childhood in Portales. It is a mural done by Lloyd Moylan at Eastern New Mexico University in the administration building. And it's Ecclesiastes 12 in a state building, which is very interesting. And there's lots of wonderful stories that I've learned about all the murals and all the paintings and the photographs and all the things that I have found since 1990 when I got started with Stephanie. And I owe it to her to saying, "You get to do the Blue Book."
Well, not only the Blue Book, but I want to show a couple of your other books. This is called Public Art and Architecture in New Mexico from 1933 to 1943. And it's a beautiful book with pictures and histories of these things. Another book that you worked with, tell me her name.
Jacqueline Hofer.
And this
Yes.
is called A More Abundant Life, New Deal Artists and Public Art in New Mexico. There's so much of it here.
And that particular piece on the front is at the federal courthouse here in Santa Fe, along with 5 other huge murals by William Penhallow Henderson. And who goes to a courthouse, much less a federal courthouse, to look at art?
Yeah.
And we hope people will do that more the more we talk about it.
Well, I invited you here because we're celebrating the PBS-TV miniseries about the Roosevelts and intimate history. And I'd like to know what were the effects of some of Roosevelt's programs, the New Deal and WPA. What happened in New Mexico?
Hundreds of things happened in New Mexico. We had 423,317 people in this state in 1930. By 1935, half of the entire population was on one of the programs. There were various programs. The 2 best known, the Civilian Conservation Corps, and the other one, the WPA, which was made up of art program, music program. Architects, writers, it put everybody to work. So we had 56,000 young men, 17 to 24, that were in New Mexico.
And how many nationally?
3 million.
Ah.
And the big thing they did, they were referred to as Roosevelt's Tree Army, because, Roosevelt was a tree farmer. I don't think too many people know that. And he thought that this would be a way to save the land from blowing away during the Great Depression, and he could save the boys and the one female that got hired in the CCC to do the planting of trees and all kinds of conservation.
So he was fighting the Dust Bowl, because he said
absolutely.
if you lose your soil, you lose your country,
Absolutely.
literally as well as figuratively, and the Depression at the same time.
Absolutely. And, of course, New Mexico, around Clayton, Raton, all up in the northeast corner, there was 75%, I think it was 76.8% of the population there that were involved in one of the programs. And I would not suspect, but what if there were a lot of Okies and Texans that were also had filtered over into our state because of trying to get away from the Dust Bowl. And so Clayton really got hit a lot.
So I think as people start to explore this resource we have in New Mexico, how can they find out where will these books help people know where to go? Say they wanted to do a tour of New Deal art in the Northwest Quadrant or on the East Side, or
the book, the first one you held up with Bill Lumpkin's photograph or painting on the public
This one.
art and architecture.
Yeah,
That will take you, just like maybe a AAA book. You can go to 90 towns in New Mexico. You can find, it tells you where the buildings are, where the public art is, where the sewer systems are, the water systems, the sidewalks, the anything you could, the sewing classes, all of the areas, the grasslands, particularly up in that part of the country too. Here again, trying to save the soils. But it will take you all over the state. We also, our organization here in New Mexico, our New Mexico chapter, has made maps of everything all over the state.
And what is that organization?
The National New Deal Preservation Association, which was created in 1998 as we were going out of office, and we had learned so much, we felt like it had to continue. And so therefore, the task force that we had created with lots of different people here in New Mexico, we brought in people from all over the country that we had learned about in their states, what was going on in their states with the New Deal. And we made this national organization a nonprofit, and we've been going gung-ho ever since. Strongest in New Mexico, of course.
We're speaking today with Kathy Flynn, who has made it her life's work, really, to find and preserve and recognize the New Deal and WPA art in New Mexico. And you do actually work nationally.
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, yes. We have activities going on in California, big time. Nationally, we're trying to save the post offices that are currently being closed or sold for a pittance, with their fabulous murals that are historic to those areas. And we're very concerned about that and worried about what's going to happen to the buildings and the murals.
So I know, looking back, we see why it's so important to preserve this beautiful, iconic art. But has there been a movement, since we have been suffering an economic downturn, not quite the depression that Roosevelt had to deal with, but hard times with high unemployment? Have you seen a movement to try to, this was a brilliant answer, the Civilian Conservation Corps and supporting artists and photographers. Has there been any even whisper of a movement like this, or was it one man's genius to do this, Roosevelt?
Well, certainly today, everybody, a lot of people, I wish everybody was talking about it and everybody would talk to their congresspersons. But there are plenty who are concerned about it's time to do it again. We must do it again. And certainly we are advocating that. But there is a program that's similar to the CCC here in New Mexico. It's the Youth Conservation Corps, YCC, and that was started a number of years ago, both with federal and state money, which Manny Aragon made sure happened when he was a senator. There are CCC-like programs in other states also. There are other youth programs in universities as part of the Roosevelt Institute, which is a youth organization on campuses all over the state, the country. Not everywhere. We don't have an active group here in New Mexico. We wish we did. But, we wish the ball would start rolling harder and faster and move towards Washington and get some people to get the message and do something about it and do some compromising and whatnot as is needed to pull something off like this.
So we focus so easily on these beautiful murals and this beautiful artwork, but there were also photographs. Didn't Dorothea Lange?
Of course. Dorothea Lange, who did a fabulous job, along with John Collier and about 6 other people. John Collier's father, John Collier Jr., was the photographer. John Collier Sr. was in charge of the Indian programs here in New Mexico, or nationally. And then there was so many other things that happened besides, Bandelier, the closest monument that we have here, those CCC boys built that road down into that canyon by dismantling trucks, lowering each part down by ropes, reassembling the trucks, and building a road back up so that then they could bring supplies in and out to build 35 rock structures down there. And then you've got Carlsbad Caverns, White Sands, Bottomless Lakes. You've got 19 courthouses in this state that were done. Every university in this state, including El Rito, has buildings on their campuses. They have artwork on their campuses. And our organization here in New Mexico has spent $550,000 preserving or conserving or restoring, because there have been some of them that have been painted over. We haven't had any graffiti on them, but we've had some painted over, and we have taken the paint off and brought them back.
Quickly, writers, because writers also were involved. Name some.
Oh, every writer you can think of in New Mexico. Ina Sizer Cassidy, who was Mrs. Gerald Cassidy, was the head of it. Later she resigned, and Mrs. William Penhallow Henderson was the leader of it. And they were all writing, and there were a large number of writers, and they did the State Writers Guidebook, which has been redone in paperback.
And that's the original one.
And this is an
when?
original one, yes, a first edition. It has lots of beautiful photographs, black and whites, in by Laura Gilpin and other well-known photographers at the time. Those were done in every state and some of the major cities in the country. The things that people were done, that got to do to go to work again and able to take care of their families, was the whole basis. Recovery, relief, reform.
And one more R, Roosevelt. So
that was his. Those were his 3 words.
Yeah. Well, we've run out of time. Our guest is Kathy Flynn. We call her the Queen of the New Deal, but she does have this beautiful book, The New Deal, and anyone whose interest has been piqued about the art here in New Mexico. Here it is, Public Art and Architecture in New Mexico. So thank you, Kathy Flynn, for joining
Lorraine.
us.
Okay.
And I'd also like to thank Paul Barnes, who's the editor and the producer of the beautiful PBS miniseries called The Roosevelts, An Intimate History. And I'm Lorene Mills. I'd like to thank you, our audience, for being with us today on Report from Santa Fe. We'll see you next week.
Past archival programs of Report from Santa Fe are available at the website reportfromsantafe.com. If you have questions or comments, please email info@reportfromsantafe.com. Report from Santa Fe is made possible in part by grants from the members of the National Education Association of New Mexico, an organization of professionals who believe that investing in public education is an investment in our state's economic future, and by a grant from the Healy Foundation, Taos, New Mexico.